I like being introduced by a mayor. And there's another mayor here. There's probably several mayors here, so it's good to be among you. I'm a little confused about my role. I mean, to come into Silicon Valley as a former mayor and talk about technology seems like, a little off. It reminds me, if you'll permit me a story, when I first graduated from law school, I worked for a law firm, and the NCAA hired me to represent them. I worked in Indianapolis, Indiana, in a lawsuit filed by a local basketball coach, a few of you may have heard of, named Bobby Knight. And so I went down to the courtroom in Indiana University, and it was one of those big old ornate courtrooms, and there was the judge is elevated to make a point, and the audience was filled with basketball fans. When I asked a question, they would boo, and when he'd answer, they would cheer. And so I said, because I was just fresh out of law school, I raised my hand and said, Your Honor, can I approach the bench? So would you admonish the witness to answer the question? The judge goes, "Come here, son." Looks down at me. I look like I was 15 at the time. He says, "I'm elected in this county. I ain't telling Bobby Knight to do anything," right? So I'm not here to tell you to do anything. I realize that I'm in an extraordinary place with extraordinary individuals in the audience. I appreciate the introduction by Microsoft and the your mayor of San Jose is one of the best in the country, and I'm delighted to be here. I'm just going to talk a little bit about what I see in terms of how technology is dramatically changing the way we think about governance and the way we improve the quality of our communities, and just kind of flip through some of those ideas. So let's think about it in the following ways, right? Kind of, if we think about government as moving to distributed governance, what are the components of that? Access, context visualization, and collaboration. Open data means nothing without those. If we use mobility as an example of how we're moving from running agencies to running systems, predictive analytics as a solution to urban problems, and the role of kind of digital economic development. Let me just footnote this because I read the excellent RFP released by San Jose recently on kind of how to close the digital gap, if you will. And it listed some of these issues that mayors across the country are struggling with, and it obviously is a condition precedent to a smart city and engaged community and successful outcomes, that if we don't have universal access to high-speed internet, just the data comments in the last presentation show us, how far we need to go. It's a little complicated, I'd say, because no city has really got this right. How much does the city participate as a source of revenue in helping the build out of the digital infrastructure? Mayors are used to spending money on asphalt. That feels like it's part of their infrastructure budget, but when you say, but broadband or conduit is now also part of the city's infrastructure, there seems to not ever be quite enough money to do that. So how one thinks about the role of the city in terms of using revenues, using subsidies, using conduit, putting together the market are issues that everyone is struggling with, and the San Jose RFP on digital inclusion is a leader in trying to cause those issues to be addressed. Another way to think about this, just in terms of kind of universality, as some of you may be aware, when I was deputy mayor of New York, we identified that there were 10,000. I know it's hard to believe in Silicon Valley, but in New York City there were 10,000 payphones. A payphone is something with, right, at any rate. So we began this process. It matured after I left and got a lot better and became this Link NYC. So those 10,000 pieces of infrastructure, right, turned out to be like 5-foot-tall iPads for all practical purposes that will provide universal citywide gigabit free wireless at the street level, right, in addition to kind of charging and wayfinding and the like. And there'll also be platforms for sensor technology. And this just raises the question that many cities are struggling with, which is, in an IoT world, how does smart furniture and smart bus stops and smart street lights and smart kiosks, how do they weave together to produce the experiences that individuals need? And one positive byproduct of this is that many people have, obviously, despite the communities in which they live, they have smartphones, but they don't have digital plans that allow them to utilize all of these resources, and this is one way to do it. Now, as we move from that issue of availability to use, right, open data, I think actually as a concept is a little bit dated now. I mean, when I was in New York City, open data meant throw up all of the ugly PDFs you can on the site and call your data open and then move on to something more important, right? But today, open data is obviously a part of the platform of how government should react with its citizens and private businesses and nonprofits. But I think we're moving past that to a point where the issue really is about context visualization and collaboration, right? Because data that's not well visualized is not usable. And the other way to think about this, and I listened to the presentation on the demographics of the Valley, right, which is that visualization drives action, right? When people can visualize what it is, then action can be taken, and this is just an example of kind of, you can do this nationally, right? Wealth divides in the San Francisco and Oakland areas. Let me just tell a quick story about this. This slide's a few years old. So I was deputy mayor, as I said, in New York City. The call center reported to me, we got 20 million calls a year, but nobody really knew what happened to those calls. There was open data, sure, you could kind of find your way through it perhaps. But then when we visualized it, right, took software, trained the community boards on how to use the software, and created this is just an example. These are obviously dynamic maps, but I got static shots. The size of the yellow dot represents the number of complaints at that intersection. But more importantly, when people drilled down inside those yellow dots, they got when was the complaint made, how quickly was the complaint resolved, what was the nature of the complaint, and then suddenly communities began to engage, right? Because I'd have a community board leader call and say, well, I'll give you a quick example. They called and said, you know, you've got a lot of pedestrian accidents or near misses at this intersection. Have you ever wondered why? She said, I can see it on this map. And I said, well, no, actually not. And she said, because there's a senior citizen's home on one side of the street and there's a pharmacy on the other side of the street, and your transportation department will not reset the wait walk signs because it violates professional engineering codes, right? But she would never have had that insight had she not been able to kind of manipulate and visualize the data that belongs to her community. So this is just an example of the direction we're moving. This is Detroit using Androids and iPhones to take pictures of blighted properties to kind of have the crowdsourcing of identification of those properties. Palo Alto and OpenGov, the mayor was a leader in terms of kind of visualizing the budget. All of these are dynamic. How much money you spend on a particular issue? Is it going up or is it going down? And then recently, San Jose released this really interesting effort to kind of beautify San Jose by kind of crowdsourcing and identifying volunteerism opportunities in San Jose areas. All of those are just designed to say, look, if it's visualized, it can become collaborative. And we're past a point in time where we think of government as the owner of all the answers and the owner of all the data and the owner of all the services. And the way to think about it now is government as a particular platform. Now, let me just flag one issue, which is, I think, a little bit more complicated, and slow down for a second. So let's think about the question the following way. How would we use the new digital tools to increase the voice of those who are often underrepresented in a community, right? Those who maybe don't speak English well, those who don't know how to manipulate the powers of government. So I think government has a responsibility to, even if it's just SMSs, to reach out to underserved communities, to invite them to grade their experiences. You know, what was your workforce training like? What was your wait time like? What was your experience with a particular city service or community service, right? How much does the after-school tutoring help your child, right? So let's think a little bit about how texting even can amplify the voice of those who are underserved, how we can curate that information, and then redesign our services as a result. And this is an area, this is from a group called Textian, originally used in Philadelphia to begin to kind of reach out and ask people to kind of grade their services as a way to go forward. And then finally, just to footnote this, and I know you've got a bike use presentation later on in the day. Of course, if we're talking about participation, we're not just talking about people talking to government, we're talking about things talking to government and things talking to people who are in their communities. And this is just a way to say, if we really want to calibrate the city services, then let's listen to what's out there, right? This is just reports on DC trying to move and accelerate its bike paths based on the IoT data generated by the bike share bikes, right? So as they drive around, how close are they to the path? Are they on a path? Are they off a path? And what's that mean for planning purposes? Now, a couple more quick points. There's this big clock in front of me. So the speed of my presentation directly is inversely related to this clock that's in front of me. So at any rate, so here's how, I was a district attorney, and then I was a mayor, and then I was a deputy mayor, and now I hang out with mayors. Here's generally how it used to work, not here, of course, not when you were mayor of Palo Alto, but in the Midwest, here's how it would work. You go back into your office, you'd meet with your professional planners. They would design a response to an urban problem. You would then go to a community meeting, because you had to go to a community meeting because that was the definition of community participation. You would listen to people yell at you for a couple of hours, and then you go back and do what you were going to do anyway, right? So that was the definition of community engagement, right? Well, no longer is that true, right, as we build models and we see things. And so how does one think about the digital tools changing the way that government co-sources engaged crowd sources with its community? And this is just one example of many. Philadelphia has used pretty powerful visualization tools to be able to not only build models in the planning department, but help their citizens build models so that they can, this presentation again is not dynamic, but you can as you visualize the building going up, you can visualize the sight lines, you can visualize the shadows. And so now we have the ability for a broader based discussion about what should happen in our particular communities. And I think that the whole planning process of hiring engineers and hiring professionals to kind of guess what it's going to be like after a building is built, these tools will obviously allow much more broadly done. Now, I don't want to watch that slide too long, you'll get dizzy, so let me move to this for a second. I want to use this just as a brief example of what I think is a larger issue, and one that you all in your public, private, nonprofit, and governmental areas are right in the middle of solving. Right? So government's organized vertically, right? So there's a transportation department, and there's a public works department, and there's a parks department, and fill in the blank. But people live horizontally, right? They don't live vertically in a department. They live in a neighborhood. And so things happen in a system. So when I was mayor of Indy, right, we had a transportation department, and they managed transportation. We had a transit department, and they managed buses. And I don't even think we had a bike department, but they do today, right? But that's not how we should think about city services. That's not how we think about community engagement. We should think about what is the system we're trying to manage. And the system is mobility, right? And all of these are pieces of mobility. So ride shares, first and last mile, taxis, rail, walking, biking, and they have dramatic effects on the quality of life in a community, on the health of the community, on the congestion of the community. And so cities are moving, including LA and San Jose and others, to managing mobility instead of managing the verticals. And if you think about it, the ability of moving not just people, but information, right? Making smarter decisions on the part of consumers, right? Showing them times and showing them transaction costs and solving the last mile problems are all significant. And almost every city in the country now is rethinking its totally outdated requirements for you build an apartment building, you have X number of parking places, right? That concept is totally outdated, and people are thinking about it. And also lifestyle changes that result from thinking about mobility in terms of people becoming more physically active, fewer people having cars and the like. So this issue of mobility then moves to obviously things that are being thought about and innovated in this particular area. But I chose two places that are leaders, Pittsburgh and Boston, not just because they're using autonomous vehicles, but because as we think about the mobility and the autonomous vehicles, then we're going to think about if you take the original map, right, of economic disparities in the Bay Area, right, and I haven't done this, but I've done it in LA. If you overlaid where pockets of unemployment are located, and then you identify where the jobs are, and then you overlay the transit routes, they don't work, right? So if you're underemployed and relatively poor, you have the longest commute times, at the greatest expense. So let's think a little bit about then, if we were in managing mobility, how we might manage shared rides to do the first mile or the last mile or drive down the transaction costs of getting to work. And so that whole package of things, I think, is an example. You could do this system discussion in almost any area. I just picked mobility because it's such a topical issue here. But it does suggest to us that government, instead of the old way in which it worked, can work in a much more collaborative way to solve these systemic problems. Now, a couple other last points. So, see if I can do this easily. So I can't, I did this work in New York City. New York City is an example of the progressive reforms that came from Tammany Hall, right? So back in another day, mayors were a little corrupt, hired their friends, et cetera, right? So what happened was there were a set of rules designed to make sure that government operated more honestly. And those rules essentially reduce the abuses of discretion by reducing discretion, right? So if you have no discretion, you cannot abuse it, right? So government ends up producing a lot of very similar widgets every day, regardless of whether a person needs none or a person needs three, right? It's like a manufacturing system. But if we step back and say, this makes no sense, now with data mining tools and the visualization tools and the data science tools we have, we can identify who are high risk, who are low risk. And particularly, there's just a couple examples here. This one is from some work done across the country, but where $3 billion a year is being wasted on people held in jails, not prisons, but pretrial jails, who actually become more likely to recidivate as a result of being locked up than not, because they're going to get released anyway. But only 10% of the jurisdictions use data to predict future criminality for purposes of pretrial release, right? So if we can do this in any area of government. Another New York City story. Here's how we used to license restaurants in New York City. If you were a small restaurateur and you came for your permit, we would manage the process so that in a year and a half, when you were allowed to open up your restaurant, you had run out of your working capital. It was almost exactly timed so that it was an excruciating experience. But the same is true of inspections. So why do we have to treat every actor in a community as equal, and when some of them are not good actors and deserve more attention, and some less? And this is from Chicago, that began to use data mining, Yelp data, and their own inspectors' data to identify those restaurants where someone was most likely to get sick and reallocate their inspectors accordingly. And the same could be done on permitting as well. So these, just to give you a quick example of this that was interesting. I was sitting at my desk in City Hall, and I got a report that a family of 5 had died in a fire in a building that had been illegally converted, multiple units in that building. And I anticipated a call from the newspapers, so I called the buildings department and said, had you ever received a complaint? And they said, well, sure, we had received a complaint. We went there once, but we get 50,000 complaints a year, and what else could we have done? I called the fire department. I got essentially the same story, which is, yeah, we got a complaint. We went out. And then there was this guy in the back of City Hall. Now, this is like 4 years ago, before fancy cities like San Jose kind of staffed up with all these data scientists. But there was one guy in the back of City Hall in New York City, and he said, look, just give me 90. I think he had an NSA background. I'm not sure exactly. I never quite figured out where he came from. But he said, give me 90 days. And he came back in 90 days, and he picked 311 data, 911 data, and tax foreclosure data, and code compliance data, and about 6 easily available data sets, and said, I can increase by 1,000 times the predictability of when a complaint is going to lead to an actual fire, right? So we took the 30 to 50,000, which now became 300, assigned teams to go out and resolve the issue in those buildings. And so if we think about predictive analytics in terms of who should be in jail, where a fire is going to occur, regulatory work, we begin to see that government can dramatically reallocate its resources to be more responsive to the community and more collaborative with it as well. And then just one or two more quick points, going back to kind of the discretionless public employee. This doesn't have to be that way any longer. This slide's based on an effort that Annie Casey Foundation did with the state of Indiana, which is take mine a lot of for child welfare workers are one of the toughest jobs in America. You know, they go into tough homes and decide whether to remove a child, and they do it without very much information. And obviously, a lot of cities now are digitizing that information, but then you've got massive amounts of digital information you can't really get to. So the Indiana theory with Andy Casey Foundation was, let's take everything we know about the child and the family. What do we know from school? What do we know from the police? What do we know from caseworkers? What do you know from siblings? Organize that information, send it out to the digital device, a tablet, but provide it in terms of decision support tools so that the field worker can actually make a better decision. Microsoft, if you're sponsoring, do I have to give you a commercial? Will that help? One of the most comprehensive and technically sophisticated example of this is the domain awareness system that Microsoft is doing in New York City with PD, so that when I was in New York City, the information was all held in the commander's office. Now, that information is organized, mined, and reorganized and delivered to the beat officer in a domain awareness system around his or her area in a very dramatic way to improve the decision-making and the management of those employees. And economic development, I'm in the heart of this, but I think it's kind of worth saying because all the rest of the country wants to be like you, that we've gone, people now recognize you don't chase jobs, you chase people, and the jobs come to the people, and that's an example as well. And your partnership is also a good illustration of this. These are just 4 young men and women from a Los Angeles urban school who are using geographic information systems in their schools to make maps to illustrate their geography and history classes, and then learning to be coders along the way so that we can kind of produce those career ladders that don't really exist. So if we look forward, what do we see? The things that you all are working on, obviously open data, but virtual systems and artificial intelligence, the VR systems for zoning, AI for answering phone calls in City Hall, machine-to-machine communication. So, you know, how do we read the case notes, and how do we listen to the sentiments of the calls, and how do we organize those things so we can have a better way to manage our public employees and hire them? Those same systems allow for public-private partnerships, right? Public-private partnership may be powered by a tech company, but it may be actually instituted by a nonprofit in San Jose, if you will, and so the ability to manage data across those allows for it. Personalization of city services, personalization of communications. There really is no, I mean, everybody who is a citizen, a customer of San Jose is also a customer of Amazon, and they know what a personalized experience can be like, and cities will get there. Predictive analytics, a lot of secure data sharing issues, privacy and others that are particularly important. But all of those, I think, roll up to the following concept. We're moving away from government to a distributed governance. And that's one of the reasons that this particular meeting is so powerful, because it's public and private and nonprofit, and they're combined together, listening to the community, curating that information, and providing services in a new way, services that are systemic and distributed, that are visualized and cognitive. And I've been at this, I'm a pretty old guy, I've been at this local government stuff for a really long time, and even in the 5 years since I left working for Mike Bloomberg, the technologies are so dramatically different that I think one could safely say we are at a unique point in time, maybe in the last 150 years, about how government can be redesigned in a way that is more responsive to the community and produces more trust. And as a kind of a local official and one who teaches local officials, I think despite the kind of background noise in Washington and otherwise, trust and community participation begins at the local level. This is a great example of that, and I'm honored to have been with you. Thank you very much.